Thank you very much, Tao. Greetings to everyone. So for me is to officially open and welcome this beautiful event today. And first, I would like to say that it is such a great coincidence that this event is taking place in Africa Month. And as we all know that in this month, we are also celebrating and acknowledging the role played by African women in our struggle and liberation. So for me, on behalf of CAS and the Nelson Mandela University, I would like to welcome our speakers, the facilitator, the audience, and everyone who have made this day and this event possible. Also not forgetting the youth from Mission Vale, also Love Life from Kariega Yotnik. So thank you very much. I hope that everyone is going to enjoy this event and fruitful and thoughtful information is going to be gained by our youth and everyone else who's participating. So thank you very much, Tao.
Thank you so much, Sianda, for just welcoming everyone. Of course, as Sianda's also just mentioned, our conversation today zones in young people and women in particular, when we're thinking through the ways in which the pandemic has exposed the ways in which women suffer highly or at high risk as they are working from home and staying at home, the high risk of domestic violence, the economic instability or insecurity that COVID has brought into their life, thinking about unpaid care work that often women and female bodies often face, thinking about inadequate access to healthcare, and particularly as we're thinking through marginalized bodies and women and children who live with disabilities as well. And so we're hoping our panelists are just going to take us through some of those various dynamics. And speaking of which, I want to give the floor over to our first panelist, and I'm going to introduce them just by reading a brief bio of some of the work that they are working on as a way of introduction into the space. Our first panelist is Dr. Refilwe Magama, who is a lecturer in the Department of Psychology at the University of Cape Town. Dr. Magama's PhD study on the constructions, negotiations, and performances of gender through Lobolo exemplifies the her transdisciplinary interest in people's everyday constructions of gender identity and the workings of power. Her work is located within African-centered feminist psychology and employs narrative methodology. Her interests include African psychology, critical gender studies with a particular interest in masculinities, love, African feminism, and decolonial research methodologies. Without any further ado, I'd like to give the platform over to Dr. Refilwe Magama. Doc, over to you.
Thanks, Sipagazi. I was wondering if you would also introduce Dr. Simone Peters, because we will be speaking. Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks so much for that as well. Just to introduce Dr. Simone, who will speak directly after Dr. Refilwe, because theirs is a joint presentation. Dr. Simone Peters is a postdoctoral fellow at the A.W. Mellon-funded First 1,000 Days of Life project. Her PhD focused on the ways in which colored bodies make sense of their gendered and racial experiences and how they construct their communities in post-apartheid South Africa. Her work makes use of photo voice methods alongside narrative and ethnographical methodologies. She's interested in Black masculinities, intersectionality, decolonial, and narrative methodologies. Okay, over to you, Dr. Magama and Dr. Peters.
Okay, thank you, Sipagazi. How do I remove this now? Sorry, this thing is stuck on another page, but I guess it doesn't matter as long as you can hear me. So I'm not going to go through my introduction because I think you've done that very well for us. The only thing that's missing from my bio is that I am a mom to a very beautiful human being who is 5 years old. And I think that kind of centers or captures some of the interests that I have. So
hi, Ellen. Sorry.
Okay. Can I continue?
I think so.
All right. So I was supposed to introduce myself and Dr. Peters, but Sipokazi has already done that for us. So I'm gonna hand over to Simone to just take you through the order of our presentation. I don't know if she is still.
I'm here to fill in.
Oh, there we go.
I am here.
Yeah.
Okay, so in today's presentation, Rifu and I will just firstly unpack our experiences of being young Black women within academia and a paper that we recently wrote that is still to be published. So we will just be unpacking some of the key points, some of our key experiences in both living through the pandemic and writing that paper. And then I will just look at some of our recent projects, one that was conjoined and another project I did looking at young migrant women and how they navigate COVID. And then we will end it off by just thinking through some questions together with the various audience members around the pandemic and where do we go to from here. And that's basically just the outline of our presentation that we will be doing today.
Okay.
Over to you.
Thanks, Mo. So I'm just gonna read from my notes a little bit, because as Sipokazi was introducing today's session, that the aim of this dialogue is to just think through the impact of COVID in different life spaces. And for us, the main impact was in our academic space. And that's why we decided to write the paper that we wrote. So the paper is titled Precariousness, Panicking While PhDing in a Pandemic. And some people have pointed out PhDing is not a word, but we are sticking to it because it's a word we like. So the paper was initially meant to capture some of the anxieties and the panic that we were experiencing during when COVID started, and which coincided with the end of our PhD journey. So we kind of finished at the same time. And at this time of writing the paper, we were meeting regularly to talk about our other projects, which also focused on the impact of COVID, but looking at the work that is done by community workers. And Simone will just talk more about that project in a bit. And while we were meeting to talk about that project, we realized that there was something that was mirrored in our experience of ending the PhD and the current anxieties that stemmed from COVID. One of it being health and financial implications. So at the time of writing the paper, Simone and I were both on one-year contracts. And for myself, that had been my 5th year in this one-year cycle situation. And we both thought about our contracts were dependent on us being students or PhD candidates, and what would happen when this process ends. Where do we now go? Because we would essentially be too qualified for internships or the current positions that we held, but also we would be underprepared for the positions that we desired to go to. So being that between Simone and I, we had very little teaching experience, we both did not have any supervision experience, and combined we had less than 5 publications. And for us at that time, and we spoke about that since, that perhaps it seemed as though we were being hard on ourselves. And in our reading on precariousness, and also those that know would know that precarious position makes you feel, puts you in this awkward position where you feel like you constantly have to be working. And because of that, we found ourselves doing many projects at that time. And this was at the end of our PhD. We were doing multiple projects together, but also individually, so that we could at least do what is called build up our CVs, so that we can be attractive candidates. But as a result, that delayed the writing process of this paper, but also other papers that we had in mind. Luckily, we were able to finish the PhDs in time and submit and get that out of the way. So for today's discussion, I don't think we're going to talk about the contents of the paper as much as we want to talk about the experiences of writing at that time in the July, Simone, of 2020, preparing to submit. I was preparing to submit, Simone just submitted, but also now, you hadn't submitted, right, French?
No, in August I submitted.
You had not submitted. So we were preparing to submit, and then COVID happens, and we both had to move from where we were. I had to go back home, and at home there's 6 people. Whereas when I was during my PhD living elsewhere, I was living by myself, had excess amount of Wi-Fi from work in my place. And then I had to move home. Home, I didn't have Wi-Fi, I didn't have the resources I had. But most importantly, the resource that I missed was the collaborative working space that I had during my initial PhD journey. I worked with very good colleagues. I had a very strong support system. At home I have, but it was more of an emotional, and during this time, when I'm trying to finish this, I need more of the intellectual support, which I had to let go. I was now far from my supervisor. And on top of that, my then 3-year-old was very attached, he hadn't seen me because I was living away from home, and also the guilt of having to now step back into that full-time mommy role became a bit challenging. And now it was dealing with that now, and also thinking about my health during COVID, thinking about finances during this time. And one of the things that was essentially very challenging also was, at the end of this journey, will universities be hiring by the time we submit? Because we all heard the stories about people losing their jobs. We heard stories about, how the working market was. And as people already were suffering from a kind of, we don't belong in academia. What is it? Imposter syndrome. Then there was the issue of, will we even be hired? Will universities be interested in opening up the space for people like us? And what does the academy look like post-COVID? And I guess for me, and I think for Simone also, we were just tired during this time. We were exhausted emotionally, we were exhausted mentally because of the journey and the project that we were doing. But also now we were suffering because we had to do this by ourselves, even though we had families. And for Simone, she will speak about our own experience. But for me, it was just an emotional time. And part of writing this paper, we went through that kind of phases. And by the time we published this paper, you'll see that this paper, from the initial draft to what it is now, it kept on becoming a journal for us, where we write into it. And yeah, I think I'm gonna just hand over to Simone in the interest of time, friend.
So, no, sorry, my daughter is making a noise in the background. So I'm torn between like running to get her and like sitting. One of the things of being a mom and being an academic, I also had to teach and have my baby around. And it's been one of the most interesting things, because being a woman and balancing motherhood, academia, balancing all those positionalities we have has been a roller coaster for me. So I can only imagine the work that I've been doing with the participants and them telling me their experiences, and then becoming a mom and physically feeling it has been an interesting roller coaster. But anyhow, to the paper that we spoke about, I think for me, one thing, like if you said for time, but one thing that stood out for me was, at the time I was both a lecturer, guest lecturer and a tutor at the time. And remembering how so many of the young women in my tutorials were coming to me because we know with the pandemic, like we heard, was that there was a lot of emotional instability, there was a lot of financial instability. We know that universities shut down, schools shut down, places of work shut down. So we know that young women were bearing the brunt of COVID pandemic. We know that young women were bearing the brunt of the pandemic. And so I think of, being a tutor, well, it's one section I talk about in the paper, and remembering so many of my students coming to me and talking to me about high levels of anxiety, high levels of depression. So we saw that there was an incline in mental health amongst our young women, because not only do you have to now, your support system is stripped from you, you have to now go into online schooling, which was a different ball game. Lecturers, we had to learn how to do online learning. We had to teach online tutoring, which became just a whole nother struggle. And I think we as academia had to learn to do things differently in COVID. Whether we got it right, it's debatable. What the path looking forward will look like. We know that we need to do things better, because we had a lot of students telling us that things were just not working on this online spaces, and that in itself also took a toll on us. Well, me personally as being a tutor and a lecturer, while also having to worry about my own PhD, my own job, precarious, where to from here, my own family and my own health. And so that was just some of my experiences going into the pandemic. At the same time, like Rifua said, we were working on a project. And in that project, we were looking at, what were caregivers, well, not caregivers, gender justice workers, what their experiences were in the field at the moment. And many of their experiences were that they were working with many people who were unemployed, many people who were struggling with care for their children. Many of the women could not go and find work because some of them were domestic workers. They now got stripped of their work. Many of them who were waiters working in the industry got stripped of their work. So many of these women were left without food, were left without resources, services. And so that project just looked at what is it like for a care worker to work in those environments? How do you help people with the pandemic that has left people devastated, that has left them unemployed? There's not much that was happening in the economy because with lockdown, we know that it was shut down. Looking at statistics that said, we had violence go up, domestic abuse go up, women couldn't access clinics for contraceptives. And so that became a major issue in terms of reproductive health. We saw there was a decline. We saw police stations talking about increases in violence against women, and then women had to live with their perpetrators because of the lockdown. And so that project for me and Rifua, which we're hoping to wrap up pretty soon, made us start thinking about, what are the experiences that women were having during COVID? What were some of our own experiences during COVID? And so that project was the sort of build up to our own paper and looking at experiences that we had, and then just mind the noise, there's building drilling happening. And then the last project that I worked on was looking at the intersectionalities between women from Zimbabwe and Malawi who are living in South Africa at the moment, and who are living with HIV and AIDS, and how they were navigating the pandemic. And so really just looking at the intersectionalities between being a foreigner, living with a chronic disease during a pandemic, and how their experiences are in South Africa. And that made me realize that, as a South African citizen, yes, I was also going through turmoil, but at the same time, their experiences were was extremely heartbreaking, because these were women that could not access the 350 grant that was given to unemployed South Africans. They were talking about having to queue for food just to be told that, you don't have a South African ID, therefore you don't qualify for these food packages, having lost their jobs of, working in homes, being domestic workers, being sent back home, talking about how their bosses couldn't know about their chronic disease because of the implications that comes with having an HIV status, and then what happens now. And so just listening to this compound of positionalities impacting those women during a pandemic, and listening to how they have to literally survive on barely anything, having to live off handouts from the churches, because our government wasn't really very giving or wasn't providing the same resources and services to the foreign national young women and women who were mothers as well. And so we see that COVID devastated many people. I think from our work, from the monograph, from our own experiences, and from the project with Zimbabwe Malawi women, looking at just how women across the spectrum were just really overburdened, looking at statistics where women were having to look after children, having to do work, having to still cook, still expected to run a household, still expected to be great moms, great wives, great partners, and just that seeing the toll on women, seeing how their mental health declined, seeing how their physical health declined, and literally just looking as researchers on the impact, not only for the women at large, but also seeing it take place in our own lives. And so in the end of this talk, I would like to know, where do we go to from here? With the other panelists, what are some of your ideas around, what is the job of researchers? What is the job of academics? What is the job of all of us who work with these type of participants who are going through all of this stuff? How do we navigate the pandemic? Because I mean, the pandemic seems to have kind of ended, but then it goes up and then it does this. So we're seeing a whole fluctuation happening. So yeah, my thing to the audience is just, where to from here. Rifilwe, I don't know if you want to end off with something.
No. I think you've covered the questions that we had. Where to from here? Because it just ties in also with the kind of conclusion that we had in our paper. Kazi, we are done. Thank you.
Thanks so much to Dr. Magama and Dr. Peters as well. And also, again, I mean, the question of some of us still working from home and I think having to apologize for not having what we think is supposed to be conducive home conditions that are suitable for the works that we do. I think that in itself is something that we also just need to think about how our homes are actually not designed to be these work environments, right? And so there's absolutely no need to apologize. So thanks for that presentation and just opening up the panel, some of the conversations touching on the precarity of the academic space, but also I think also importantly, this additional care work and mentorship that young women in academia and young or women academics have to do that go beyond just simply what is required of them as academics. And I think that speaks to the question of progression in the academy, the career progression, and how these unpaid care work that women academics and young women academics have to do don't necessarily count when we think about or could actually hinder your progression in the academy itself. And also think importantly the question of right towards the end, Dr. Peters talking about migrant women whose citizenship, who do not have citizenship in the country, right? And the stigma that surrounds having chronic illnesses while in a global pandemic, and how one has to negotiate that. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for those inputs. And of course, leaving us with questions. And so we're hoping during the engagement session, colleagues, friends will be able to join in and add as well. Okay, as we move along in the conversation, I want to welcome Ayanda Tito, who is an award-winning social scientist with more than 12 years of experience in developing and managing community development projects, community sustainability strategies, and project management. Ayanda Dito is currently a partnership managing director in a company called ThinkLink. The organization supports nonprofit organizations, corporations, and government to partner better towards community development. Her work focuses on mental health awareness in Black communities, gender-based violence, and the boy-child focus programs. Ayanda, over to you.
Thank you so much, Spogazi. Thank you for that nice introduction. As I said earlier on, that I'm having problems with my camera, so I'm not going to be able to switch it on. Apologies to everyone that has joined. I must say that when I was thinking about today's subject, I got a bit overwhelmed because I did not know what I wanted to really zone into while speaking about the subject at hand today. And that's because as women, we went and still are going through a lot due to the pandemic. I mean, being a woman in South Africa on a normal day is very, very difficult. And when the pandemic hit, it felt like our challenges became even that much bigger. We were stuck at home. Our jobs were suddenly in jeopardy. We were left to deal with our anxieties, and there was literally no outlet for us. As mothers, we had to take care of our families. We were expected to work longer hours by our employees, and we felt that we had to smile through being tired, overwhelmed, feeling unappreciated, and some of us while being in abusive situations. So in my line of work, we focus a lot on women and the girl child, just making sure that they get to access all the resources that are available to them. One of the projects that we have working on with one of the partners is called Caring for Girls. It is a sanitary towels distribution program. And I know that a lot of people sometimes when they hear that somebody cannot afford a sanitary towel, they cannot relate because it's such a small thing. But this program makes sure that it helps to keep the girls in school and that they don't miss any school days while they are on their periods, just because they cannot afford to buy any sanitary towels. And I remember a few weeks ago, I was having a conversation with a government official about this program and how we can expand it to work with local shelters for women and children and offer more services beyond the current ones. During our conversation, he says that there's been a lot of displaced women and children due to the abuse at home that has been enhanced by, on to say that he knows that men don't want to be abusive, but because of the stress, they end up being the perpetrators of abuse. To be honest, I've never felt so stunned, to a point of literally being frozen. I didn't know how to respond because my mind just could not comprehend what who is entrusted with protecting women and girl lives. As that got intensified by the lockdown restrictions. It left many women contact and support networks. Increased financial struggles further limited many women's ability to leave abusive situations. Financially, women are the ones hit hard by the best secure job of their livelihoods. I'm sure I speak for all women when I say that the 2 years into the business, what makes us stronger, what makes us safer, how we can be adaptable, and what doesn't. I think going further, what we need to do as the nation is to focus on rebuilding in ways that empower and protect women and girls, and understand that the choices we make today will have long-term implications, not just for women and girls, but for our overall survival as South Africans. Thank you, Spagazi.
Thank you so much there, Ayanda. And I think that luckily we might have been able to hear the crux of your argument as well, just amidst all those connectivity issues. But thank you also just for bringing that up. I'm thinking about the girl child in particular, and so how we think about COVID and how girl children or in fact society, just the education system had to send everyone out of institutions back home, and how often some girl children or schools in collaboration with civil societies and movements are able to provide things like sanitary towels, and what the pandemic in us having to be antisocial could have hindered that access to that healthcare for the girl children. And that's also just, speaking about that in terms of how then girl children who in some cases, of course, disproportionately have to do, as opposed to the boy child, have to do care work in their homes as well. And how that would have affected the ways in which they are able to participate in the already different and dynamic at that time education system of being in school at home, right? And so thank you for that, for bringing up those particular points. I'm going to bring in our last panelist to give in their input. I'm going to give the platform over to Wefuafa Job Allen. Just as a way of introduction, I will briefly touch on their biography. Wefuafa is a resident fellow, tutorial fellow at the University of the Witwatersrand with the topic Techno-Effective Elections and Illegitimate Power, WhatsApp Voice in Kenya's Electoral Deliberations. Ellen holds a Master of Arts degree in Communication Studies from the University of Nairobi and a bachelor degree in Mass Communication from Makerere University in Uganda. With several publications in the discipline of communication, Ellen's ongoing projects include book chapters titled Redress to Gender Disparities Through Indigenous Language Radio Among the Bukusu Community, in Indigenous Language for Development and Social Change Community in the Global South, and Media Representation of Africa's Successful Failures in the Fight Against COVID-19 in African and COVID-19. All right, Ellen, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm in a public space, so kindly bear with the background noises that may come by. Straight to the issues here, I would wish to present a report I worked on during the COVID-19 period, a report by Sonke, Gender and Justice. And it's an African non-profit making organization. And we looked at Kenya, Cameroon, South Africa, and DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. Our topic was the emerging effects of COVID-19 pandemic on gender-based violence in Africa. But then since I'm in South Africa, I was in charge of collecting the gender-based violence cases which we analyzed. And so I would like to share an interesting perspective I came across during the COVID-19 period, which concerns gender, more so the girl child or women in this case. I came up with a methodology whereby I just tried to review the literature available on gender-based violence, and then I looked at the media reports, what the media was reporting, and then I looked at the documents available. I looked at the reports from Sonke Justice. I looked at reports from what they call government statisticians in South Africa, and the reports indicate very contrary. Even the literature indicates very contrary to the dominant narratives that were being presented by all the media in South Africa. The media were perpetuating this narrative that women are being killed and women by men, and there is a danger on women. But then the reports, especially from the government statistician, was interesting. Actually, during the period in 2020, the government statistician said that there are 5 times men who are dying than the women in South Africa. And these men are being killed by fellow men. They are being killed they are committing suicide, and they are being killed by women. 5 times more than the women, but then the media does not pick that narrative. Remember, I'm sorry to mention these, they are sensitive issues, and many other names that were dominant of ladies who had been killed. It was, the media ran with the issue because of the alarmist nature in it. Not to downplay that ladies were murdered, but that the issue we found out is that there were better ways which we could put out the narrative by rectifying the situation in society than running with the idea that women are being killed. Because the argument here also, especially from the Sonke reports and documents, were that there are many deterrent measures by government to stop the killings, to stop men from killing women. But then the killing was not stopping. And so the idea was that there is need not to sensationalize the issue, but to address the societal issues that cause these killings. And the COVID-19 pandemic actually brought out this deep-seated issue, which was more colorful during the period where in a day or two, there was a media mention of a lady having been killed. And so it brought out the idea in a way that we could ask ourselves why it is happening, rather than there were actually, the media reports were having emotional outbursts about what should be done to the men, unaware that these men killing, actually, if left, will kill themselves anyway. And the people they were killing, sorry, very sorry about background noises. The people that were being killed are close. Some were mothers, some were sisters, some were spouses, implying that these men have issues not necessarily with the female gender, but with the gender that is close to them. They were not killing strangers. They were killing people that are close to them. And then we went on to analyze and found out that the reasons for the killing is the pressure that is put on men that they have to provide. The girlfriend expects the boyfriend to provide. The husband will expect the wife will expect the husband to provide. And these kind of pressures are the ones we could be focusing our energies on to alleviate this danger of gender-based violence, which affects women more, because women are killed, sure, they are killed. The media's problem is to sensationalize it when reports indicate otherwise. Actually, there are many interesting reports there, including one that whereas men commit suicide and die. If they don't commit suicide, or before they commit suicide, they would kill any other person around, men or women. But then the media will pick it if a woman is killed, but they will not pick it if a person who is so stressed that they will commit suicide, kill a fellow man. It will be an ordinary crime. And so this will be something we could, this could be something that we could look into and analyze from a more sober perspective, because the media then deprived the public the sobriety needed to debate the issues better. Yet literature and cross libraries and even interviews with the sociologists and societal elites who know about these issues would actually indicate that there are 5 times more men dying than the women. But the narrative put out by the media was alarmist, perhaps to win audience, but unaware that it misleads and it actually deprives the public the opportunity to engage more productively on societal issues. This, to me, sounds, of course, controversial to the popular narrative held in public, but going on to write a paper about the gender-based violence in South Africa, and I invite anybody, any people willing to co-author this article, because the report was out as a whole African aspect, but then there are interesting South African perspectives, which I realized after listening to radio stations, reading the newspapers, and engaging the literature and documents available. Thank you. I will stop there for now, and I invite any questions.
Thank you so much, Wefafa, for that input. And just touching on some of the ways in which the media reports as a way of sensationalization, I suppose, but also what are some of the layers that we ignore, and some of the conversations that are left out in how the media chooses to document what is happening. And I think particularly, where COVID-19 is concerned, the communication in terms of who is considered to need the education around, firstly, on the medical aspect of COVID-19 itself, firstly, one. But I think also, secondly, what you're touching on as well here is how we're thinking through the issues of intimate partner violence and domestic violence, and how society frames these constructions of gender and places these expectations on women and on men, as you mentioned, to be able to have, to provide economically, of which COVID-19, of course, had implications on how people were able to then respond to that, right? And be able to be economic contributors in their homes, and as you may be alluding to as well, in the intimate relationship. So thank you so much for those inputs, and thank you so much for the panelists who I know are contributing under various diverse conditions of load shedding and having to move to different places, but also having to navigate the home space and issues of connectivity and other commitments. So thank you so much for those contributions from the panelists. I'm now going to open up the opportunity for colleagues in the Zoom, and I know there are colleagues in the Love Life Center at Tinaga, and colleagues from Mission Vale campus, who would like to bring in questions, comments, inputs. In the Zoom, of course, you can raise your hand if you so wish. I'm not seeing anything in the chat section from my end, but I will take hands at this moment if there are any hands for the panelists. I'll ask Setu just to be on the watch out for me as well. I see Mpho has a hand up. I see one hand. Okay, so let's take Mpho's input. Just before you speak, Mpho, I also, we have sufficient time to have the conversation, and so I want everyone to use their time sufficiently, but also sparingly. And so I'll just ask colleagues to try and just stay within the range of 3 minutes if possible. I don't want to be a time dictator, but if it's possible, just so that we can get more and more input. But obviously I understand that not everyone is able to always be concise on the first go. Okay, Mpho, you can unmute yourself.
Thank you, Spogazi, for that. And thank you to the panelists. I hope I'm audible enough. I just want to make a comment on to what the last speaker mentioned about, I think we also had this debate on Twitter, how men are not safe as we perceive. But I think the other conversation that we're missing is that the very system that the angry feminists, as they call them, are trying to fight against is the reason why they're also dying in themselves, because they need to be these tough people, they need to be protectors, they need to be providers. And whereas we're trying to move into a world where we're saying to the men, go to therapy. If you want to cry, you can cry. But we live in a society where I think me, in being from Limpopo, I'm sorry, I need to say this in Venek. A boy is told from a young age, you're like, men don't cry. You can't be emotional. You can't talk about your feelings, certain things like that. And I think if we avoid that conversation, then we're always going to continue saying that when women are not safe, we're going to go back to the gender-based violence issue, which is still really true. Women are less safer than men. But if men also come to a point where they say, okay, this system that we're trying to protect, or the system where we really thrive that marginalizes women, is the reason why we're dying now, is the reason why we're not safe, And I think that is a really hard conversation that we need to have as a society, to realize that it's really not working, and that women that are fighting for equality, or the angry feminists, as they call them, they really do have a point to some extent, that, we need to fight for equality. The system is, patriarchy is not working. It really isn't. So I think, yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Mpho. Are there any other hands, colleagues? Just want to see. Okay, I'm not seeing anything. So with Mpho's question, I understand that it might be more suited for Wefafa's input, but I would invite all other panelists to respond to it if they feel so inclined. I'm also just going to leave a question as well, maybe a little bit more directed to Ayanda and the type of work that Ayanda does, and it's linked to Mpho's question as well on the question of mental health. I do see the hand, I'll take you just now. So the second question I want to put in is to say, so, Ayanda, you were talking about how there's this expectation for more work expectation on various bodies as opposed to others. But of course, Mpho's question is also raising the question of mental health, and how statistics are showing us that men seem to be more affected by that, particularly when we think about the suicide rate, right? I'm wondering if you have any inputs to give in terms of how post-COVID-19 workspaces can be different to accommodate issues of mental health, for their workers. So this just was something for you to think about, Ayanda, but I'm going to give you an opportunity just now. I just want to take the third question. Vuyokazi.
Thank you, Spokazi. Well, I don't know if mine are questions or just comments, but I think they're directed mostly to the first two speakers. And that is because I felt like when the pandemic started, I had just finished my degree and I just moved to a workspace, which I feel like that was mainly, I don't want to say ignored, but also, yeah, it was blue ticked of the first graduates that were moving into the working environment. And especially if it's a working environment where you have to type up work like research work or administrative work. I think it was very difficult to transition from that, noting that we were not in a workspace before. We don't know how it works. Of course, the hours were there, 8 to 4, but in between that, there was a gap, a huge gap, especially workshops that were not given to those graduates that were working online to actually rope them in. I understand that it was equally difficult for those that are used to the workspace, but I think it was even more difficult for us to catch on. Let's say if I wake up at 8, where is my break in between? How do I handle emails that come in at 9 if I'm going to make breakfast at 9 for the whole family and whatnot and still have to be glued? So I think those were one of the very tricky parts, especially for a girl child, because I had to go home, of course, when it was COVID, were closed. So I had to be home, and at home, there's my father and mother. I have to wake up and make breakfast or whatever. And in between that, I don't want to lie, it was very, very, very difficult to understand the time frame, to understand how to handle meetings and all that. So I think it's one thing that also was very much difficult on our side. And then the other thing I wanted to perhaps move and analyze on is the fact that there was we seemed to forget how COVID and probably online or working online, I mean, we focused on working online more, and then we forgot about the women that were, for lack of a better word, helpers at where they couldn't be home, but help somewhere else where they work at and not be home during COVID times. They had to leave their children and be at another place to work, which is also another thing that impacted greatly on COVID, because their work now was not online as us. They couldn't work online, but they had to be physically in someone else's home and leave their children, leave their families to nurture for themselves or whatever while they were away from home. So that also struck me as something that impacted on helpers that are female, that they had to leave their homes. I know for a fact that in my family, there are aunts that would tell us that she, during the time of COVID, had to leave her kids and go to wherever she was helping because they needed her there at that time, and she actually had to stay there and not go back home because there were also restrictions on traveling. So that also, with COVID, impacted on many families and also impacted on those women's lives as well. Leaving now the gap, I think, for abuse of children in those homes, if the household, where you find the household only, there's a woman there. There was a gap left for an abuse for those children. Also, there was a gap left for instability in those families, if you can put it so, because the mother could only come back if she'd get a permit. And also as well, for some, it would be a male that was absent. So yes, I just wanted to tap on those two things, Pokazi. And thank you for the speakers. I think it was very informative. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Vuyo and Vuyokazi and Mpho. I'm going to ask Refilwe and Simone to come up first. You know, the first question being around the transition from graduate to work life, and graduate readiness, I suppose. And then the second one being the question of domestic workers, and I think also healthcare workers as well, who often had to be home or frontline workers is what they were called, who often had to be at work and put their lives in danger, and not be able to socially, I suppose, help prepare their families for the transition of being in a COVID world, because they were preparing the health sector for that, or they were preparing other homes for that, you know. And I think just another question to add to you, Refilwe, as well, and Simone, is whether or not the institutional cultures of universities have been able to adjust and establish different kinds of graduate attributes, in addition to creating different kinds of workspaces. You know, so how do we then integrate ourselves and into the ethos of what higher education institutions are, when we don't have that physical relationship, if you like, taking into account that there are first years that are completely online first years. And then the question that's more directed to Ayanda, as you'll come after them, is the question of workspaces and whether they are accommodating issues of mental health, in thinking through the issues of the high suicide rates. And of course, the question also links to Wefuafa's contribution about men being suffering the most, but I also think queer bodies as well, and how that access to healthcare that already existed before the pandemic for queer bodies and women bodies still persisted. And so what does that mean for a trans person who can't get access to their hormonal medication, for example, right? Yeah. And then the question, sorry, for Wefuafa is just to comment on social media spaces and the media, and how that reporting exposes a bigger societal problem about how we construct manhood, for example, and how that we are now expected as women who are also implicated by this fear system, right, of living in South Africa, also expected to now do additional labor of also caring for men in a space where there's this fear narrative. Okay. Refilwe and Simone?
Okay, Simone, I don't see her, so I'll just go ahead.
I'm here, but you can go first.
Okay. So I'm gonna just touch a little bit on the evolving kind of implications of COVID. In that, one of the things that maybe we didn't talk about here is that Vuyolas is right, you know, because you are, when COVID started, you had certain anxieties and things that you were dealing with. And then when the restrictions moved and there were different kind of measures put in place, it kind of also morphed the kind of anxieties that we were sitting with. So as Vuyolas was talking about, that here you are, new at work, and now you have to learn the systems of working, but also you have to learn your new job under very strict kind of restrictions where you are not prepared. And I think not just with you, Vuyolas, we saw the similar kind of challenges with people who were doing this work forever, the care workers that that Simone spoke about. So they were working with community-based organizations and community-based centers in trying to support people. And now all of a sudden, there's this expectation by management, by funders, that continue doing this work, continue working, being a counselor, continue training people on issues of domestic violence. But there wasn't any training for some of them. And those that could use online platforms, the organizations they were working with were not prepared. So I just think that there's a missing narrative on the evolving demands of COVID in the workspace, but also in community work that we're doing. And I think Sipokazi's question about the university space, and someone said that did we get it right? We don't know. But there is that kind of, in my opinion, there's the kinds of students that we have. Yes, we have a lot of students suffering from anxiety and mental health issues, but also students that have not learned how to cope with university, and maybe we haven't actually thought that far, because when it's issues of health and life or death, those are our primary concerns. And the other part that I want to touch on is essentially this thing about essential workers and women and their place within COVID, right? So Vuyokazi touched also about the women who had to stay in their workplaces. And I remember in last year, there was a students that I had, and they were doing a project which I really liked. And I wonder if they've continued with it, called The Face of Pandemic, of COVID, of the essential workers in COVID. And they were looking at how every sphere of the essential workers, so for example, the nurses, most of our nurses are females, teachers, domestic workers, retail workers, most of them are women. And one of the things that she had hoped to do with that project was to look at the president's speeches and government speeches and how people are talking about, and if people are actually aware of the implications that COVID has on the everydayness of women's lives. And I remember a conversation we were having, and she says, you know, because women are essential workers, and then they come home and they're essential people at home, they touch everything. And if this woman gets COVID, chances are everybody in that house is going to get COVID. And yet there isn't a recognition or something put in place for talking about beyond the demands and the care work of women, who the burdens that they had to carry, but also how one person's exposure could actually affect the rest of the family. And so she was looking at if there would be any kind of services or measures put in place specifically for women because of the role they play in their homes, but also because women are the face of the essential services. And last part that I wanted to touch on was the something that we found in our, when we were doing the other project, that when we collapse the home life with work and school, so our homes become, and in the paper that Simone and I were writing, that essentially my bedroom became school, became office, became home, because me and my son would spend a lot of time in there. When I was writing, he was there playing, and whatever exercises that he had to do, you know, he was doing them in the bedroom. We kind of blur the lines or even break them in totality between what it means to doing work. And Vuyokazi is right. You know, we get emails at night, and it became a norm for people to just work all the time, from the time you wake up to the time you go to bed. And one of the things maybe we need to think about is that post this moment, do we revert back? Do we know how to go back to establishing healthier working hours? Because it's probably almost 4, and here we are on a Zoom call. When we were working in person, these kinds of engagements would end. But now it became a norm that people would start talks at 6 online. It just became like this unhealthy working pattern that we are now in. I'm afraid that we are going to continue with it post-COVID, because somehow our managers, our funders have recognized that, hey, people can work forever. They can work 24 hours if need be. And it's not because people sometimes don't have boundaries, but because the workload just demands that. Because now with COVID, some of us are full-time mothers, 24/7, full-time workers, and those that are studying full-time, because everything is now in one space and there are no breaks. Whereas before, there were breaks that I work from these hours, I get home, I cook, I do this, and then I do my studies at this time. But when everything happens in the same space, everything happens at the same time. And I'm going to stop there. Simone?
Yeah, I think I would just add on the first question of graduation readiness. I think COVID has really, like Rifu said, messed up the whole way that we think of work and do work. I think of myself, I did not see my supervisor. So when I started my postdoc, I did not see my supervisor for the whole, the whole year. I only recently saw her, and because everything was done online. And so really you lose the sense of camaraderie. You don't know who you work with. You don't even know the systems. You have to learn them very quickly. And then that thing of navigating space and time, when space is shared, when time is basically a whole big blur. So it becomes very important for companies and universities to help students set boundaries and set time. I think that becomes very critical. How universities and the culture of university has accommodated students. I mean, I know I was in the critical psych course where I was a tutor, and I remember even when I was lecturing on the course, I remember that they told us, you know, many of our students were moving back home. They did not have Wi-Fi, and obviously the university made data available to students. And so we had to be very conscious about the content. How are we distributing content to make sure that the content is concise, that it does not use massive megabytes, so that it's accessible. And I remember we also sent packages out to students who were in rural communities who could not get data and so forth. And so there was a lot of strategies put in place from the institution to make sure that the students were getting the material on time, that they were accessible to students. I also believe that, you know, there was a lot of mental health services made available. Well, at least I know from our course, we did everything in our power to make sure that our students knew that, you know, these are the resources if they need the resources. Some of us were working overtime. I mean, I know I had some students in my classes who were suicidal, and so I took it upon myself to do check-ins with some of my students, those students who were telling me that they were having anxiety and depression problems. I took it to our head of, not our head of department, but the head of our course, and then we gave those students resources, because at the time my supervisors of the course was also saying that I can't also burn out myself because I'm not a clinical psychologist. So I don't have the capacity to help those students. And so just referring them to services that could help them. And so that's what I know we were doing in our course. I'm not too sure as an institution what was happening, but I do know that every course was doing their best to help as far as possible with students and to integrate students into working systems. I know that we had, what was this, our career service. They gave out a lot of online courses on how to become ready for work, how do you look for work, how do you integrate into work systems. I never attended one myself, so I wouldn't know how effective those were, but I do know that the university was trying to do something in those times.
Thank you so much, Dr. Simone and baby, and Dr. Refilwe. I'm going to ask Ayanda. One of the questions we directed was particularly the question of mental health in workspaces, but also I'm just wondering if you are able to comment just a little bit in terms of you know, how you were touching on the girl child who's still in school, whether or not you know, teachers were capacitated enough to deal with people who were affected by COVID. So, you know, all of us had lost people from COVID or had suffered from COVID. Can you just comment just a little bit in terms of the capacity of the schooling system to be able to deal with a child that comes from a home where they are also dealing with COVID? Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Sfogazi. So in terms of workspaces accommodating mental wellness, that is still something that's lacking. But I think that before we speak about the impact of the pandemic on our mental health, we first need to understand that South Africa has always been a wounded country. We maybe needed the pandemic to shine the light brighter on that program. So I think in order for us to deal with mental health issues, we first need to heal the historical psychological scars. which means that our policies have to change. We need to introduce trauma-informed responses, be it at work, in our communities, and how we can relate with each other. And then coming back to your second questions about teachers, whether they had the capacity to deal with a student that had problems at home and now coming back to school and how they were dealing with that, is that, so we need to understand that teachers are people as we are. They were going through the pandemic challenges like we were going through the pandemic. Their mental health was also impacted by the pandemic. And when we went back to work with the schools that we're working with, we found that there was a lack of excitement for the teachers. They were feeling drained from what they were going through, not just in their own lives, but also having to make sure that the learners are getting all the materials that they need on time, and then having to find ways to keep in touch with their learners, either using WhatsApp or sending emails if they have the means to do that. Some of them had to go to school even during the hard lockdowns because they had no other choices but to do that, especially the teachers that were taking care of the matric learners in 2020 especially. So I think they're still getting back to a space of trying to just get the excitement back as being teachers. But it's still, it's a working in progress, because you find that because they're not excited about the work, they're not even motivated to go to school, it then impacts the classroom, which then impacts the students in how they absorb what is being taught by the teachers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ayanda. And really, I mean, the point you're talking about now as you close about how, you know, teachers had to use different communication strategies and various technologies, for example, in primary schools to communicate with the parents of the children and send in communication. And here, you know, Refilo was also talking about how she had to be the teacher to her 3-year-old son as well during this time, while also having to work on emotional bonding and the scarring that COVID-19 has left. I also think, you know, the important thing you're talking about the ways in which communities deal with issues, you know, so you're talking about, for example, embroidery and how people use communities converge and meet in you know, city centers to do community-based projects as a way for people to connect, particularly with embroidery, of which there are various, of course, scholars in the psychologies. Prof. Buleng Sekgalo, who written about embroidery as a form of healing, which you are flagging. But I'm also reminded as you're speaking, Ayanda, about how the question of social distance and how that has created this disjuncture in terms of how we relate as humans, as African, and what it means for us to have those physical connections. So old people teaching younger people embroidery skills in community township. What happens to those intergenerational relationships, right? At a time where we are having to social distance. And of course, there's other work and conversations in terms of just rituals and traditions that need us to physically be with each other in the physical in order to affirm the spiritual and affirm those rituals. So thank you so much for those inputs, Ayanda. I'm going to bring in Wefuafwa into the conversation. You know, the question there was particularly looking at social media and the narratives social media drives, of course, about who is a victim, right? And Paul's question there to say, how then do men become victims? What really is the bigger question or the systemic issue that forces perpetrators at times to also be victims is, Projects they're asking, mentioning about how the nature of the patriarchal society is that it disadvantages the very same people who are possibly perpetrators, and that's also something to look at. But I also just want to add in, perhaps you can comment, Wefafa, Simone was talking about migrant women and the displacement. Firstly, the displacement of you being a migrant in South Africa, seconded by the displacement of you not being able to experience some of the benefits of being a citizen, the 350, some of the food packages, etc., because you're not a citizen. Particularly now as we're thinking or experiencing these various discourses and violences around foreigners in our country. I'm just wondering if you just want to make a comment on that, the media coverage of those particular, or the lack of media coverage of the displacement of migrants in South Africa during COVID, and how that coverage looks like now in the conversation of Operation Dudula, right? Yeah. Wefafa?
Thank you. Let me begin with the prior one on social media. We all know the influence social media has on society. While the participant was asking, I was trying to imagine a person who pays a 1 million Lobola bride price to get a lady, and yet in this African society today, we have actually failed to differentiate between dowry and bride price. Dowry, in simplistic terms, is in Europe and Asia traditional societies, where a lady inherits her parents' property and walks with it into a marriage to support herself, just in case the man is not able. Bride price, on the other hand, is the recognition that the African girl child does not inherit the parents, property. And so when she goes there, the parents of the boy who has a right to inherit gives part of the inheritance to the girl's parents, not to the girl, but to the girl's parents, in appreciation. You see, so there is that difference. And so when we fight for a girl child's equality with the boy child, but we don't touch such societal deep-seated traditions, we actually disturb the balance that held society together prior to COVID and even contemporary society. And so such are the dynamics that social media will propagate. You find someone who can really pay bride price and pay it high, and another who cannot. The one who cannot succumbs to undue pressure possibly. And so we have an imbalanced society from such a perspective. So that's how I could briefly comment about that. And on immigration, well, I'm from Kenya and I have relevant documentation. But still, I'm afraid of walking in the streets of Johannesburg, because the people who feel they own the country will not ask for documentation. So the lack of the media to propagate the true narrative that with the documentation you are rightfully in the country and deserve treatment like any other person, and this is across the world. So the media fails to capture that and will run with the populist agenda. The Dudula, for instance, would really make it to the news media, but a person who has documentation but is being harassed will not make it to the media. And so that the Zimbabwean women, immigrants who are in South Africa, are just found in the crossfire. Otherwise, the real issues are the real issues are politicized and populist to an extent that sobriety that is lacking on the streets, sobriety is lacking on the streets, and yet it is on the streets that Dudula is administering justice. I don't know if I'm making sense, but then we've just misplaced our priorities by taking the populist approach and missing out on the realities. Thank you.
Thank you, Efwafa. Sorry, I didn't realize I was muted. I think that that's such an interesting point you're raising there. So the first one in terms of documentation, right? And I'm thinking about how, again, this idea of displacement, sorry, but how our institutions that are responsible for, you know, regulating the documentation of non-South Africans, you know, had to also could not use traditional ways of how they documented, meaning paper and stuff like that, because that was also add on to the spread of the virus itself. And so the lack of being able to move into different kinds of technologies as a way of moving forward also just caused that. And now you're talking, of course, about the issue of migrant women being casualties, or even just some documented people who don't have the documentation because of the institutions and the delays, or the incapacity of the institutions to be effective in how they do their work, and how they are caught in crossfire, and how Dudula is in some way shifting some of the responsibility that the state needs to have onto community people and onto society. So yeah, thanks so much for that. I have noted one hand, David, for a comment. I am going to give us again another opportunity for anyone in the room, anyone in Tinaga, anyone in Mission Vale, who wants to give a comment, absolutely, a comment or a question. I'll allow David to go first. David Cloran, sorry.
There you go, good afternoon. I just want to respond to the earlier comment where it was mentioned that 5 times the number of men die. And I almost find that a little troubling, because it seems to suggest that men are then a victim. I think that the focus needs to remain that the killers are still largely men. I would imagine, I don't have stats at my hand, but I'd imagine that the majority of women who are killed in their homes. They're killed in their safe space, whereas I'm speculating that a fair percentage of the men who are killed would be killed in riskier environments. So suggesting that we're talking about 5 times the men dying, it reminds me of the All Lives Matter versus Black Lives Matter. The issue is that women are being killed by men. Men are the killers. And I think that it largely stems from South Africa's violent past. We've had a violent culture since the colonial era. And I feel as though that violent culture is only really going to be stemmed once there is a remedy to the social injustice, or to the injustice, not the social injustice, the injustices that plague our society. We have an angry, frustrated population. I also want to reiterate the one lady who commented about boys don't cry. It reminds me of an article I read where married couples, when the wife dies, quite often the man ends up remarrying. And it was suggested in that article that the reason for that is because men, we don't talk to anybody outside of the bonds of marriage, whereas women have and the other side of the article was saying that women, if they lose their husband, don't get remarried as readily. And it was suggested that women have a network where they can talk about issues that plague them. They can talk to their friends, whereas men don't talk about issues that are real. So it's almost as though, and this is how I'd like to end, is that we actually need, we need to normalize conversations around mental health issues, because I think firstly, we need to find a way to fix the societal injustice that we have, but men additionally need to normalize conversations around mental health issues, because we feel as though talking around those issues is a sign of weakness, when actually it's not. When we don't and we kill somebody, that is a weakness. That's me.
Thanks, David. I'm seeing Tlaga Nipo's hand. Tlaga?
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope I'm audible. I found myself quite intrigued by the earlier comments you made, Sipogazi, about our homes sort of not being fit for work. And for me, my experience in the corporate world was not necessarily that the home itself is not fit, because I think we experienced so much productivity during COVID times, but more that the conception of the type of homes that we were supposed to belong to as young professionals was a very particular type of home, a very urban concept, a very, young woman living in her flat in Maboneng, no dependence or anything like that. And the idea of a young woman, for example, trying to work from Ukayakulu was never considered. And HR, the HR of the company that I was working for at the time, admittedly said so. They had never considered that because they had a very specific type of, work from home environment in mind. So I think we need to reshape the way we see the home as a workplace, because some of us are going to have to work from our bedrooms, and that shouldn't be taken to connote any type of unproductivity or underproductivity. So I think that if we are to make this work from home situation the new normal or the acceptable way of doing things, we need to reshape the way we think of the home and the acceptable type of work environment in the home. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Ntlaga. I'm just checking for hands if there are any other comments, hands, questions, thoughts. Just going to give it 2 seconds to see if there's anything. Okay, I'm not seeing anything in particular. I'm looking at the time, so definitely also just comments coming in. There were waves coming in, like waves of solidarity or waves of agreement, I suppose. Comment from Refilo saying, I agree with Ayanda's points. We often forget to consider who cares for the carer. For your guys is saying even men that are killed by men. I think responding to David's comment. So thanks so much for that. I feel compelled because also we were alerted that we should not be working at this time. I feel compelled to be shifting the panelists towards just responding to those very two complicated comments, but just adding much more texture to the conversation, those two comments as they make their closing comments as well. So I will give each panelist about 3 minutes, if they so wish, just to make those closing comments. And so I will change the order and I will give Wefwafwa the space to go first if you're ready. You can respond to both the comments in any way, and of course, your closing comments as well.
Thank you. Well, you're very right, David. It's disturbing. What I presented is disturbing. And my perspective was that the idea was to find a way of, my idea is to try and find a perspective through which we can address the societal issues besides blaming anybody. But it is disturbing. What I presented was entirely disturbing. And so for my closing remarks, sorry for the background noise. For my closing remarks, I would just thank the facilitator I didn't know you would do such a perfect job amid this trying time. And so I'm just grateful that keep it going. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wefafa, for also accepting the invite and just being part of this network of us thinking about some of the work that we do differently. I'm going to ask Dr. Refilwe. Okay, so you can respond to the comments, Doc, and closing comments or remarks.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I don't have any more response. Just to say that thank you for the invitation. It was really good to be in the space, and also, I mean, the questions that were posed. So thank you for engaging with us and what we had to share. Of course, these are topics that we could speak on the whole day, and they would evolve into different spheres as we go along. So it's been really good. So thank you, Sipogazi, for the invite.
Thank you so much. And then Ayanda, are you ready?
Thank you, Sipogazi. I also don't have anything to add as a comment. I think just maybe as something for us to take with is that I think we also need to be patient with ourselves. We've only been dealing with the pandemic for 2 years, and we are a country that's been dealing with historical issues for like more than 20 years now, and we're still struggling to get to a point that is comfortable for everyone. So it's not going to be an overnight thing where we have a country that is very receptive of talking about mental health issues, or even workspaces that are comfortable in dealing with that. So we just need to be patient with one another, understand that even the leaders that are in those workspaces are also dealing with their own mental health issues. So that's my closing comment, and also just to thank Conrad for putting this together for us. I've really, really enjoyed being part of the conversation today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sison. And then Simone, apologies for disturbing your child's workspace, home space, sorry.
No, yeah, because it's that time, so I'm just having it on me. But anyhow, I think for me, what stood out as a masculinity scholar, the conversation that David brought up, where, you know, the complexities of how do we look at men, how COVID has shown how, you know, vulnerable men are, but also the danger they pose to women. So I would have loved to have explored that more, just because it's one of my interests, and the politics of masculinities within South Africa. So that was a comment and David bringing up some really critical and important points for us to think through when we just throw out statistics and what does that really mean, you know. But it was a very interesting conversation we had today, and like Refilwe said, it's a conversation that could linger on, because we literally touched on so many aspects. And when we bring in intersectionality and different positionalities, the conversation becomes more complex. And so thank you for just having me and for engaging me on this topic. And I really hope that as a country, we can do better for each other and for our, you know, foreign citizens as well. But I do agree with that sentiment that, you know, be patient. We still have a while to go. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Simone. And I think also just as I bring in Siphosethu Sandi to close, you know, Nhlakanipo's comment just about this imagined person, this imagined worker that I think industries and institutions need to consider about the complexities of just firstly, mentally where we are at, what kind of person we are, and what value we would add to organizations and workspaces, but also when we are not physically in workspaces, what are the conditions that we are faced with in order for us to perform work and to be productive in our home. So thank you so much. I want to bring to the platform Siphosethu Sandi to close off. Siphosethu. Okay, good afternoon, colleagues. My name is Usipho Sandi, and today I have a small but a very important job, and that is to thank everyone basically for being part of this conversation. So on behalf of CANRAD and CAS, this is the first dialogue out of 4 dialogues that happened throughout the whole year. So I'm inviting everyone to just always keep a lookout for these sort of dialogues. So I'd first like to thank all of our panelists for your insights and your wealth of knowledge. This dialogue was actually really quite rich, and the conversations, as Dr. Makama was saying, are conversations that we could go on and on, still having. I'd like to thank Ugogo Spokazi for your seasoned facilitation skills. You really held the conversation together really well. You never disappoint, Siabulela. I'd like to thank everyone who took time out of their busy schedules this afternoon to be part of this dialogue. It wouldn't be possible without you. I'd also like to thank the CANRAD team, Mr. Sonabo Stirman, Lesego Nkosi Nhlakanipa Mahlangu, Ms. Sianda Andres and Uncle Rodney for all your work just putting together this seminar. I'd also like to shout out to the students who are watching from UTNEC and Mission Vale. As Spokazi mentioned earlier on, this is part of basically Africa Week events that are happening in the university this week. So I'd like to say thank you so much, Siabulela Nangamso, and happy Africa Month, everyone. Thanks, Spokazi. Thanks so much, Seti. Thank you, everyone. See you at the next dialogue.